The autumn rain drummed against the windows of St. Mary's Lutheran Church as Reverend Marcus closed the piano lid in the basement rehearsal room. It was October 15th, 1987, and the evening choir practice had run later than usual in the small town of Brookfield, Indiana. The 4 teenagers who made up his youth choir had just finished practicing "How Great Thou Art" for Sunday's Harvest Festival service, their young voices creating harmonies that seemed to transform the cramped basement into something sacred. Amanda Foster, 16, had been the soprano lead, her voice clear and strong despite the chaos at home where her mother worked double shifts at the canning factory to make ends meet. Beside her stood Kevin Riley, 15, whose tenor voice had finally settled after months of adolescent cracking, and Lisa Chen, 17, whose alto harmonies provided the foundation for every hymn they attempted. The bass section belonged entirely to Marcus Thompson, 16, whose deep voice seemed impossible to believe coming from his slight frame. Before we dive deeper into this mystery that would haunt Brookfield for decades to come, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Same time Thursday, everyone, Reverend Marcus had called out as the teenagers gathered their music folders and jackets. The church basement felt warmer than the sanctuary upstairs, heated by an ancient furnace that wheezed and clanked throughout their 2-hour practice session. Amanda had mentioned needing to pick up groceries for her mother, and the others offered to walk with her to Peterson's Market on Main Street since it was on everyone's way home through downtown Brookfield. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. When Amanda didn't return home by her usual time of 9:30, her mother Janet called the Riley household. Mrs. Riley's voice grew increasingly frantic as she explained that Kevin hadn't come home either, and she'd already tried calling the Chen and Thompson families with the same result. By 11 o'clock, all 4 sets of parents were gathered at the Brookfield Police Department, where Chief Robert Hayes took their statements with growing concern. Brookfield in 1987 was the kind of place where teenagers didn't simply vanish. The town of 4,000 residents sat in the heart of Indiana's corn country, surrounded by farms that stretched to every horizon. Most families had lived there for generations, their roots running as deep as the oak trees that lined Elm Street. Children walked to school unescorted, played outside until dark, and the biggest crime Chief Hayes typically dealt with was the occasional drunk driver or domestic disturbance. They probably decided to catch a movie in Richmond, Deputy Jim Watson suggested, though his words carried little conviction. These weren't rebellious kids looking for trouble. Amanda worked weekends at the Five and Dime to help her single mother pay bills. Kevin spent his free time helping his father at the grain elevator and had never missed curfew in his life. Lisa was valedictorian of her junior class and president of the Future Farmers of America chapter. Marcus had been accepted early to Butler University on a music scholarship and spent most evenings practicing piano at the church. The search began before dawn. Volunteers gathered at the fire station as word spread through Brookfield's tight-knit community. Farmers left their morning chores to comb through cornfields and check abandoned buildings. The volunteer fire department organized search parties that spread out in every direction from downtown, calling the teenagers' names until their voices echoed across the flat Indiana landscape. State police arrived by mid-morning, bringing bloodhounds that picked up scents leading from the church to Main Street, then seemed to disappear entirely near the old Greyhound station that had been closed for 3 years. Detective Linda Harrison, transferred from the Fort Wayne office, began interviewing everyone who might have seen the 4 teenagers that Thursday evening. Eleanor Peterson, whose family had run Peterson's Market for 40 years, remembered the teenagers coming in around 8:15. "They seemed happy," she told Detective Harrison, her arthritic hands trembling as she poured coffee in the store's back office, laughing about something Kevin had said during practice. Amanda bought bread and milk, and Marcus grabbed a candy bar. Nothing seemed wrong at all. But Eleanor's assistant, 17-year-old Brenda Walsh, remembered something different. Amanda kept looking toward the front window while they were shopping, Brenda recalled, like she was watching for someone. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said it was fine, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The last confirmed sighting came from Harold Zimmerman, who was closing his hardware store across from Peterson's Market. He remembered seeing the 4 teenagers walking together down Main Street around 8:30, heading toward the residential area where most of them lived. But Harold also remembered something that chilled Detective Harrison's blood. A dark pickup truck that had been parked near the post office for most of the evening, its engine running despite the mild October weather. Detective Harrison's investigation revealed troubling undercurrents beneath Brookfield's peaceful exterior. The town's economy had been struggling since the farm crisis of the early 1980s, when falling crop prices forced many families to sell land their ancestors had homesteaded. This economic stress had created tensions between longtime residents and newcomers, particularly the small community of Vietnamese refugees who had settled in Brookfield after the war ended. Lisa's family had arrived in 1982, sponsored by St. Mary's Lutheran Church as part of a refugee resettlement program. Dr. Chen had been a prominent physician in Saigon before the fall of South Vietnam, but in Brookfield he worked as a night janitor at the high school while studying to pass American medical licensing exams. The family had faced subtle but persistent discrimination, from unsigned letters complaining about foreigners taking jobs to whispered conversations that stopped when Lisa entered a room. The investigation intensified when Marcus's younger brother Timothy revealed that Marcus had been receiving strange phone calls for several weeks before his disappearance. Someone would call asking for Marcus, but when I'd get him to the phone, they'd hang up, Timothy explained to Detective Harrison. It happened maybe 6 or 7 times. Marcus said it was probably just prank calls, but I could tell it bothered him. Phone records from 1987 were primitive compared to later technology, but Detective Harrison managed to trace several of the calls to pay phones around Brookfield and neighboring towns. The pattern suggested someone was tracking Marcus's schedule, calling when they knew he'd be home from school or choir practice. The detective's investigation expanded to include surveillance of the teenagers' daily routines, revealing that someone had been watching them far more closely than anyone realized. The breakthrough came when Detective Harrison interviewed Janet Foster about Amanda's behavior in the weeks before she disappeared. Janet worked as a seamstress at Fletcher's clothing factory and often didn't get home until after 7 o'clock, leaving Amanda to manage household responsibilities and care for her younger siblings. But Janet had noticed changes in her daughter's routine that now seemed ominous. Amanda started walking different routes home from school, Janet recalled, her weathered face creased with worry and guilt. When I asked why, she said she liked seeing different parts of town, but that didn't make sense. Amanda was practical, not the type for scenic detours, and she started insisting on doing the grocery shopping herself, said it gave her time to think. Detective Harrison realized that Amanda might have been trying to vary her routine because she felt she was being followed. The detective's interviews with Amanda's classmates revealed that several students had noticed a man in a dark pickup truck parked near the school on multiple occasions throughout September and early October. The descriptions varied, but most agreed the driver appeared to be middle-aged, with graying hair, and wore work clothes typical of local farmers or construction workers. The investigation expanded beyond Brookfield's borders when the FBI sent Agent Patricia Wong to coordinate with local law enforcement. Agent Wong specialized in cases involving missing minors and brought resources that Chief Hayes' small department couldn't provide. She set up a command center in the high school cafeteria and began systematically interviewing everyone who had contact with the four teenagers. The federal investigation uncovered disturbing information about several men in the area with criminal histories involving minors. The most promising lead involved Dale Hutchinson, a 42-year-old construction worker who had moved to Brookfield 6 months earlier to work on a highway expansion project. Hutchinson drove a dark blue pickup truck matching witnesses' descriptions and had a criminal record in Ohio that included charges related to stalking teenage girls, though he had never been convicted. When agents arrived at Hutchinson's rented trailer on the outskirts of town 3 weeks after the disappearance, they found it empty. The trailer park manager, Mrs. Dorothy Kemp, told them that Hutchinson had paid his rent through the end of October, but had left suddenly the Friday after the teenagers disappeared, claiming a family emergency required him to return to Ohio immediately. A search of Hutchinson's abandoned trailer revealed items that made Agent Wong's investigation team exchange grim looks. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, they found photographs of all four missing teenagers, apparently taken without their knowledge as they walked to school, worked at their part-time jobs, or attended church functions. The photos were organized in manila folders labeled with each teenager's name, along with handwritten notes detailing their daily routines and habits. Most disturbing was a hand-drawn map of Brookfield with the teenagers' homes, school, and regular hangouts marked in red ink. Notations in the margins indicated observation points where someone could watch their movements without being seen. The level of detail suggested months of careful surveillance, turning the teenagers' familiar hometown into a hunting ground where their every move had been catalogued and analyzed. The FBI's search for Hutchinson led to Ohio, where they discovered he had used multiple identities over the past decade. Birth records showed that Dale Hutchinson was actually Dennis Ray Hutchins, a drifter with a history of construction jobs that allowed him to move from town to town throughout the Midwest. Police departments in Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin had files on him dating back to the late 1970s, mostly for harassment and trespassing complaints that had never resulted in serious charges. Detective Harrison and Agent Wong traced Hutchinson's movements through employment records and witness statements, revealing a pattern of behavior that suggested the Brookfield case might not have been his first. In 3 different towns where Hutchinson had worked construction jobs, teenage girls had reported being followed by a man in a pickup truck, though none had been harmed or abducted. Brookfield appeared to be where his escalating behavior had finally crossed the line from harassment to violence. Despite intensive efforts by federal and state law enforcement agencies, Hutchinson seemed to have vanished as completely as his victims. The investigation followed leads across multiple states, but found no trace of the man or his truck. Some investigators theorized he might have fled to Mexico, while others believed he had assumed another identity and was hiding somewhere in the vast network of transient workers who moved between construction sites and seasonal employment throughout rural America. The emotional toll on Brookfield was devastating. The close-knit community had never experienced anything like the disappearance of 4 beloved teenagers, and the knowledge that they had been stalked by a predator living among them shattered the sense of safety that had defined their way of life. Parents began driving their children to school instead of letting them walk. Evening activities were cancelled or moved to daylight hours. The easy trust that had characterized relationships between neighbors gave way to suspicion and fear. Janet Foster aged visibly in the months following Amanda's disappearance. She quit her job at the clothing factory to spend her days searching for her daughter, driving back roads throughout Indiana and into neighboring states following up on every reported sighting or anonymous tip. The family's savings were depleted within 6 months, forcing them to rely on charity from church members and community fundraisers to pay basic expenses. Kevin Riley's parents, Tom and Martha, struggled to maintain their faith in the face of their son's disappearance. Tom had served as a deacon at St. Mary's for 15 years, but after Kevin vanished, he stopped attending services and began drinking heavily. Martha threw herself into organizing search efforts with an intensity that worried friends and family members, leading teams of volunteers on expeditions that grew increasingly desperate and far-ranging as months passed without results. The Chen family faced additional burdens beyond their grief. Dr. Chen's application for medical licensure was delayed indefinitely as investigators scrutinized every aspect of the family's background, looking for connections that might explain Lisa's disappearance. Anonymous letters arrived at their home suggesting they should go back where they came from, and several windows were broken by thrown rocks during the winter months following the disappearance. Marcus Thompson's parents, Robert and Diana, dealt with their loss by establishing a scholarship fund in their son's name for students pursuing music education. Robert, who managed the local bank, used his connections throughout Indiana's banking community to raise money for the fund, channeling his grief into something constructive that honored Marcus's memory and dreams of becoming a music teacher. The investigation remained active for 2 years, but by 1989, leads had been exhausted and resources redirected to more recent cases. Detective Harrison kept the files on her desk and continued following up on occasional tips, but the trail had grown cold. The 4 teenagers' photographs joined countless others on bulletin boards in police stations and post offices throughout the region, their young faces becoming symbols of innocence lost and justice deferred. Brookfield gradually adapted to its new reality, though the town was forever changed by the events of October 1987. Parents developed new routines for monitoring their children's whereabouts. The high school implemented policies requiring adult supervision for all after-school activities. Local businesses installed better lighting and security measures, transforming the casual, small-town atmosphere into something more guarded and watchful. St. Mary's Lutheran Church struggled to rebuild its youth programs after losing 4 of its most dedicated young members. Reverend Marcus blamed himself for not recognizing signs of danger and retired early, unable to continue serving a congregation where every hymn reminded him of the voices that had been silenced. The basement rehearsal room was eventually converted to storage space, too painful for anyone to use for its original purpose. As years passed, theories proliferated, but facts remained elusive. Some residents believed the teenagers had been killed immediately after their abduction, their bodies hidden somewhere in the vast agricultural landscape surrounding Brookfield. Others held on to hope that they had been transported far from Indiana and might someday return or be discovered alive. A few conspiracy theorists suggested local cover-ups or connections to organized crime, though investigations never uncovered evidence supporting such claims. The case was officially transferred to the Cold Case Unit in 1995, where it joined hundreds of other unsolved disappearances from across Indiana. New investigators periodically reviewed the files as forensic technology advanced, but the lack of physical evidence limited their options. DNA analysis, which revolutionized criminal investigations in the 1990s, required biological samples that had never been recovered from the Brookfield case. By the turn of the millennium, many of the original investigators had retired or passed away. Chief Hayes died of a heart attack in 1998, taking with him intimate knowledge of the case that had defined his final years in law enforcement. Detective Harrison moved to Florida after her retirement, but she kept copies of the case files and continued checking missing person databases for any trace of the 4 teenagers who had haunted her dreams for over a decade. The families gradually found ways to live with their losses, though none ever fully recovered from the trauma. Janet Foster remarried in 1995 to a widower from Richmond who helped her raise Amanda's younger siblings. She kept Amanda's bedroom exactly as it had been on October 15th, 1987, creating a shrine that both preserved her daughter's memory and made moving forward nearly impossible. Tom Riley never stopped drinking heavily after Kevin's disappearance and died of liver failure in 2001. Martha Riley became a fierce advocate for missing children, volunteering with organizations that helped other families navigate the nightmare of having a child vanish without explanation. Her expertise, born from devastating personal experience, provided comfort and practical guidance to parents facing similar ordeals. Dr. Chen eventually passed his medical licensing exams and established a successful practice in Indianapolis, but the family never returned to live in Brookfield. Lisa's younger brother became a police officer, dedicating his career to investigating crimes against children in honor of the sister he barely remembered. The Chen family held private memorial services each October 15th, gathering wherever their scattered lives had taken them to remember Lisa and pray for answers that never came. The Thompson family's scholarship fund grew over the years, eventually providing full tuition assistance to dozens of students pursuing careers in music education. Robert Thompson lived to see several scholarship recipients become successful teachers themselves, creating a legacy that honored Marcus's dreams, even as it highlighted the tragedy of their unfulfillment. Diana Thompson kept a garden behind their home where she grew Marcus's favorite flowers, finding solace in nurturing beauty in memory of her lost son. The breakthrough that would finally provide answers came in March 2023, 36 years after the disappearance, when demolition work began on St. Mary's Lutheran Church. The congregation had dwindled over the decades, and the building was being razed to make way for a community center that would serve Brookfield's changing population. Construction supervisor Tony Benedetti had grown up in Brookfield and remembered the missing teenagers, though he'd been only 12 years old when they vanished. During demolition of the basement where the youth choir had practiced, Benedetti's crew discovered something that had been hidden for over 3 decades. Behind a false wall that had been installed during renovations in the early 1990s, workers found 4 music folders bearing the names Amanda Foster, Kevin Riley, Lisa Chen, and Marcus Thompson. The folders contained sheet music for hymns the teenagers had been practicing that final Thursday night, but more importantly, they contained evidence that transformed understanding of their disappearance. Amanda's folder held a journal she had kept during the weeks before she vanished, documenting increasingly frightening encounters with a man who had been following her around town. Her careful handwriting described a pattern of harassment that had escalated from random sightings to direct confrontation. The final entry, dated October 14, 1987, revealed that the stalker had approached her outside Peterson's Market and threatened to harm her family if she told anyone about his attention. Kevin's folder contained photographs that made current investigators' blood run cold. The images showed the interior of what appeared to be a basement or underground space, equipped with camping gear and supplies as if someone had been preparing for an extended stay. More disturbing were photographs of the teenagers themselves, apparently taken during their captivity, showing them bound and terrified in the same underground location. Lisa's folder held letters she had written to her family during what investigators now realized had been a period of captivity lasting several days after the abduction. The letters, never sent, described being held in a basement or storm cellar somewhere outside Brookfield, along with her 3 friends. Lisa's precise handwriting documented their captor's behavior and comments, providing crucial details about his identity and motivations that had been missing from the original investigation. Marcus's folder contained the most damning evidence of all, a detailed confession written in an adult's handwriting, apparently composed by their abductor. The document described the planning and execution of the teenagers' kidnapping, along with disturbing details about the killer's motivations and methods. Most importantly, it was signed with the name Dennis Ray Hutchins and included information that only the perpetrator could have known. The discovery of the music folders immediately reopened the case as an active homicide investigation. Current Brookfield Police Chief Amanda Rodriguez, who had been a high school student in 1987, worked with state police investigators and FBI agents to analyze the evidence using forensic techniques unavailable during the original investigation. DNA analysis of the folders and their contents provided definitive proof that they had belonged to the missing teenagers. More importantly, investigators found genetic material that matched samples from Dennis Ray Hutchins that had been collected during arrests in other states throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. The evidence conclusively linked Hutchins to the teenagers' abduction and murder, solving a case that had remained a mystery for over 3 decades. The investigation into Hutchins' activities after leaving Brookfield revealed a disturbing pattern of criminal behavior that had continued for years after the teenagers' murders. Database searches showed arrests for harassment, stalking, and attempted abduction in multiple states, though he had managed to avoid serious convictions by frequently changing identities and locations. In 2018, Hutchins had been arrested in Arizona for breaking into a home where teenage girls lived, but he died in county jail of a heart attack before trial, taking his secrets with him to the grave. The confession found in Marcus's folder led investigators to a remote farm property 20 miles outside Brookfield, where ground-penetrating radar revealed the location of 4 burial sites hidden beneath an abandoned barn foundation. The property had belonged to Hutchins' uncle, who had died in 1985, leaving the isolated farmstead empty and unmonitored. Forensic excavation of the sites confirmed the worst fears of families who had waited 36 years for answers about their children's fate. The remains of Amanda Foster, Kevin Riley, Lisa Chen, and Marcus Thompson were finally recovered in May 2023, allowing their families to lay them to rest with the dignity and ceremony that had been denied for over 3 decades. The discovery brought closure to one of Indiana's longest-running missing person cases, though it also renewed grief for families who had never stopped hoping their children might somehow return alive. For the surviving family members, now aged and scattered across the country, the recovery of their loved ones' remains provided both relief and renewed sorrow. Janet Foster, now in her 70s and living in Florida with her second husband, wept when police called with the news that Amanda's body had been found. The knowledge that her daughter's suffering had ended quickly provided some comfort, though it could never erase decades of wondering and hoping. Martha Riley, who had dedicated her life to helping other families of missing children, felt a complex mixture of emotions when Kevin's remains were identified. The certainty was what she had prayed for throughout the long years of searching, but it also meant accepting that her son would never walk through their door with an explanation for his absence. She returned to Brookfield for the first time in 20 years to attend Kevin's funeral, finding a town that had grown and changed but never forgotten its lost children. Dr. Chen had passed away in 2019, never learning what happened to his eldest daughter, but Lisa's mother and siblings gathered in Brookfield to finally lay her to rest. The service at St. Mary's new community center was attended by hundreds of people, including classmates who had become grandparents themselves, while Lisa remained forever 17 in their memories. The Thompson family's vigil ended when Marcus's remains were identified through dental records and DNA analysis. Robert Thompson had died in 2015, but Diana lived to see her son's body returned home. She chose to have Marcus buried with his piano music and a program from the Butler University Music Department, honoring the dreams that had been cut short by a predator's violence. The revelation of what had happened to the four teenagers sent shockwaves through Brookfield's current population, many of whom had moved to town after 1987 and knew the story only as local legend. The knowledge that the young people had been murdered by someone who had lived among them, attended local businesses, and observed their daily routines highlighted the vulnerability that exists even in the most seemingly safe communities. Chief Rodriguez used the case as an opportunity to educate residents about recognizing signs of predatory behavior and the importance of reporting suspicious activities to law enforcement. The investigation had revealed that multiple people had noticed concerning behavior from Hutchins during his time in Brookfield, but the social norms of 1987 had discouraged reporting suspicions about someone who hadn't committed an obvious crime. The music folders that had preserved evidence for 36 years became symbols of how truth can survive even when carefully hidden by those who seek to destroy it. Investigators theorized that Hutchins had hidden the folders behind the false wall during construction work at the church in the early 1990s, possibly intending to retrieve them later, but never finding an opportunity to return safely to Brookfield. The case closure brought national media attention to Brookfield, transforming the quiet farming community into a symbol of justice delayed but not denied. True crime documentaries and podcast series examined the investigation, highlighting both the limitations of 1980s law enforcement technology and the persistence of families and investigators who never gave up seeking answers. For Brookfield itself, the resolution of the case marked the end of an era defined by mystery and fear. The community could finally move forward, knowing that their lost children had been found and their killer identified, even though justice in the traditional sense remained impossible due to Hutchins' death. The story became a testament to the power of evidence to survive attempts at concealment and the importance of never abandoning hope for truth. The four teenagers whose voices had once filled St. Mary's basement with sacred music had finally found a way to speak across the decades, their testimony preserved in the very folders where they had kept their hymns. Their final song had been one of justice, bringing peace to families who had searched for so long and ensuring that their memory would be honored with truth rather than endless questions about what might have been.